Well, great to see everybody today. It's another beautiful sunny day. And we're here together to worship and praise God and to be together as a church family. And there are certainly lots of blessings around us, plenty of good things to go around. I think sometimes if you focus too much on just the bad things happening in your life, maybe there's something going on in your family, strife at work, political problems that we can see in the news, or cultural changes. Sometimes if we focus so much on just the bad stuff, we forget that these are really, really rich and blessed times for us. And as always, God offers incredible spiritual blessings. And it does not have to be a beautiful sunny day, and you don't have to have wealth, and you don't have to be young and healthy to partake of God's rich spiritual blessings that are at our disposal. And so let's thank God always for the days that are before us. But let's also not be Pollyannas, because there are hard days. There are difficult times that we face, as Christians have faced throughout our history as a people. If you turn with me to 2 Timothy chapter 3, we're going to look at a passage here in 2 Timothy 3, and we'll be studying in verses 1 through 11 today. 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 11. And we'll start as an introduction, of all places, with verse 1. And I'd like to read verse 1, and then we'll get into some things here. 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 1. But realize this, that in the last days, difficult times will come. What does it mean by last days? Now, that's a word or a phrase that gets used a lot throughout the scriptures, and it has different contexts. And when you look at it in a certain context, prophetically in the Old Testament, it can mean something. When Paul talks about it incidentally, it may mean something else. Last days is a term that's just used when you're in a time of decline. Now, sometimes that's decline in a society or a civilization. Sometimes that's decline in terms of the coming to close of a covenant with God or a period of history. So whether we're talking about the last days before the judgment day, or the last days of the first century, or the last days before the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, and that period of time where God's presence could be seen in some physical place in Jerusalem, that came to an end also. Or maybe, and I think this is what we're really talking about today, is we're just talking about the last days as the final era. That everything after Jesus is, in a sense, the last days. There's nothing new coming, no new revelation. If you're hanging out thinking that God's going to come out with another Bible, if you're hoping that maybe we get another Messiah because Jesus didn't quite cut it, and I'm going to kind of wait around and see what God comes up with next. Like, you know, when an iPhone comes out or a new pair of Nikes comes out, you're like, I think I'm going to hold off on this one. I heard they're going to make some big changes next year, so we're going to hold off and see what's kind of like coming down the pipe here with Nike or Apple. Like, if you're waiting around for like the next thing that God's going to do, this is it. We're in the last days right now. It's Jesus or it's nothing. We're in the last days now. Now, in the context of what Paul is writing about here in 2 Timothy, Paul also understood that in these last days, there would be troublemakers that would come. There would be false teachers and false prophets. He told that to the Thessalonians in another letter that he wrote to them. And you can see that history shows that by the end of the first century, there were a number of different heresies that had crept into the ranks of God's people. Those heresies typically surrounded the nature of who Jesus was. Was Jesus two beings in one body? Was Jesus a spirit being only and didn't really have a physical body? Was Jesus just possessed by the Christ or some other kind of demigod? There were a lot of theories that came about there. And Paul is saying, watch out, because in the last days, people like that will come. Stuff like that will happen. And you're going to be faced with a time where you have to stand up for truth in those last days. In a sense, I think, there are a lot of last days. He could be talking about any number of different periods of human history. There are a lot of last days that even you and I face in our lives. The last days of a school year coming to a close. Those are always bittersweet. We went to Heidi's 5th grade promotion ceremony the other day. By the way, I don't remember being promoted from 5th grade. Like, you know, when you were in grade, did you have a graduation for kindergarten and then 5th grade? And I don't remember that ceremony, but maybe it's just a matter of bad memory. But, you know, bye, May. I know. Rebecca says that a lot of times when she's at home being upset, she just cries for Daddy, thinking that if Daddy was there, he wouldn't have disciplined her or something like that. I don't know, because when I'm alone with her, she's crying for Mommy. In any case, Eliza, don't you start up also. But there are a lot of last days. Again, last days of a school year that are always very bittersweet. There's some uncertainty about what the future may hold for you. Going away to college, going off to high school, or going off into the adult world. There's last days in a family, where a family may, for one reason or another, be in decline. That name is not going to be carried on to the next generation. I've personally known a number of families that for whatever reason, because of tragedy or whatever it happens to be, that last name or a name, a junior, a third, a fourth, whatever it happens to be, comes to an end for whatever reason, tragically. Sometimes we're in the last days of a dying civilization. You ever get the feeling sometimes that, and this is not me being unpatriotic, I love America like anybody else, but you know, you get the sense that every civilization, you know, rises and is in its peak and then declines. And if you deny that, you're really just denying the witness of all of human history. Because human history has shown that every kingdom and empire and civilization of men rises and eventually falls. And we may be in the last third of our existence as a civilization. Churches also decline as well. There are last days of churches when a church may look around at a mostly empty auditorium and say, we used to fill this building. We used to have young people running around in the hallways. We used to have a lot of hope and enthusiasm, energy. We used to do things, have activities and works that we did as a church. And here we are now in our last days. In the last days, difficult times come. And those last days may look different for everybody, but I think that the last days have a distinctive flavor, no matter what you're talking about. The last days of anything, again, a family, a civilization, a church, a community, the last days always kind of have the same flavor to them. And that's what this passage is going to talk about here beginning in verse 2 in just a moment. Essentially, 2 Timothy 3 is giving us a broad spectrum definition of what decline looks like. It is essentially giving us the flavor of the last mouthful of poison before doom is met. You want to know what decline looks like? You want to know what the last days taste like? This is what the last days taste like. Pick up here in verse 2 and read with me through verse 7. And we'll stop and make comments along the way, by the way. For men, he says, in these last difficult days, men will be lovers of self. They'll be lovers of self. You know what defines the last days for most things is people become insulated and they become self-focused, and it's no longer about service in a community or charity to those who have need or loving your neighbor as yourself. It's about me, 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 and all the things that I care about, like we studied at 9 a.m. from Haggai. You worry about your own houses, but you don't take care of the house of the Lord. You fill up your purse, but it's a purse with holes in it in the bottom. You eat and you're never full. Men will be lovers of self. And you want to know what defines the last days of anything? Selfishness is what defines the last days. They're lovers of money. It's all about money. Paul told Timothy in another letter, 1 Timothy chapter 6, of all the evils of money. Yes, evil is a root of all, money is a root of all kinds of evils. Not money itself literally is the root of all evil, as we often misquote it, but it's a root of all sorts of evil. And the love of money, for by the love of money, many people have ruined their lives. Lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, arrogant. They always have something to say, but it's always about themselves. Boastful and arrogant. Revilers, reviling. That's a word. We don't use reviling very much, do we? Reviling is the sort of word you find in like a Melville novel or something like that, right? But they're revilers. Reviling is just the idea of just really ugly, sneering speech towards somebody else. They're disobedient to parents. You want to know what defines the last days of anything? The breakdown of respect in a family. And when children stop respecting their parents, you better believe that that's not going to be good for the next generation. When they try to raise their own children and have no idea what it means to have respect, order, and discipline in a family structure. Disobedience to parents is one of the paragons, one of the defining features of decline and the last difficult days. And let us always be aware of that. Now, it's easy to say when you're a parent, you got your kids and they're sassing back at you. But maybe as an adult child, I need to be practicing for myself. Am I still being respectful to my parents in their old age? Disobedience to parents is not just a lifelong problem, but the answer in obedience and respect and honor is a lifelong solution. Ungrateful. When people stop being grateful for the things that they have, for the things that they've inherited, for the blessings that surround them, you can be sure that that is something that's in decline. And this is not, I don't want to reveal my gray hair or anything. I am regrowing my beard, so I guess there's no avoiding it at this point. But it is one of those things where when you watch enough people on TikTok, you listen to enough Instagram Live, and there is definitely an undercurrent in our civilization of a lack of gratitude. A lack of gratitude for opportunities and physical blessings and the things that surround us. But it's ungratitude. And unholy, he says. Unholy. Holiness is the idea of being set apart for something special. And when you're not set apart for something special, you know what you end up being? Junk. Let's be real about it. What is holy is set apart and special. Everything else is junk. There's a reason why we keep the fine china in the cabinet. We only pull it out every now and then on special occasions. And there's a reason why we take the paper Dixie plate and throw it away when we're done. Because if you're not holy, you just junk. You just junk. Unloving, after all, God is love. We show our obedience to him in our love in 1 John chapter 5. We show our love by loving our neighbors as ourselves. And as John points out in chapter 4, if you can't love your neighbor who you see, then you certainly can't make a claim to loving God who you cannot see. In John chapter 13, they'll know you're my disciples because of the way that you have love for one another. Love is the defining feature of those who are holy. It is the defining feature of those who have eternal purpose and eternal call. But they're unloving. They're irreconcilable. Irreconcilable is just a fancy way of saying they don't like getting along and they're not interested in getting along anyway. And when you find yourself always at odds and you don't even want to get along, but it's just easier, and here's a hard thing, when it's just easier to discard inconvenient relationships, you've become irreconcilable. Because you don't care about how hard it is to maintain a relationship. You're just interested in finding the easiest, quickest, cheapest way to get out of it. That is what it means to be irreconcilable. Malicious gossips. Not that regular gossip is okay, but there certainly is a level of severity that Paul adds to this notion of the malicious gossip. Without self-control. That's a defining feature of decline. You remember what is said in the book of Isaiah, chapter 22. There's a great passage in Isaiah 22 back in the Old Testament that talks about people who lack self-control. And I just want to read it really quickly here, and I think you know exactly where I'm going. In Isaiah chapter 22, beginning in verse 12, notice here what the prophet Isaiah says. Therefore, in that day, the Lord God of hosts called you to weeping and wailing, to shaving of the head and wearing of sackcloth, and instead there's gaiety and gladness, killing of cattle and slaughtering of sheep, eating of meat and drinking of wine. Let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we're probably just going to die anyway. That is a lack of self-control. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, so hey, live for today. Who cares about consequences? Those consequences might not even happen. Just live for today. Do what you want. Eat what you want. Drink what you want. Sleep with who you want. Lack of self-control. But they're brutal as well. Brutal is also another one of those like really, really rich words. It just has the sense of like there's violence and then there's brutality. And brutality is like taking that violence, just that next step up. They're haters of good. Not just that they don't want to do good, but that they hate good. They actively try to end good. They try to suppress good, stop the good. They are haters of good. Treacherous, which is the idea of deceptive. They're reckless. Reckless. Just do whatever you want. Don't worry about safety. We're just reckless. The other day, this is one of those moments where I really don't want to come across as the cranky 40-year-old man, young people these days. But I was stopped at a light, and there was a car pulling up, and it was a convertible, and it had 4 teenage girls in it, and they had their music blaring at full volume, and they were having the best time ever because it was a beautiful, sunny, 75-degree day, and none of them had their seatbelts on. And I wanted to be that guy. I wanted to be the 40-year-old dad who rolled his window down and said, girls, seatbelts there. And as they drove off, I wanted to yell, your parents love you so much. Now, we can make light of that until we read in the news the next day that 4 girls died in a car wreck because they didn't have their seatbelts on. Because they're living for right now. Who cares what the consequences might be? We're reckless. They become treacherous, reckless, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. Another word for that is hedonism. It is the worship of pleasure. I just want to feel good. Holding, he says in verse 5, to a form of godliness, although they have denied its power. Oh, I believe in God, but believing in God doesn't impact me in any way. Sure, I believe in God, but I don't live in any way that reflects that. Yeah, I believe in God, but I'm not sure I believe in the Jesus guy. I'm like, I believe in God as long as God is just he's a distant and abstract force in the universe. Sure, I believe in God, the same way that I believe in tarot cards and psychic palm readers. Of course I believe in God. But it's a belief in God that denies His actual daily power over our lives. Yes, they hold to a form of godliness, though they've denied its power. And he says in verse 5, avoid people like these. You want to know why? Because those are people in decline. Those are the people whose lives are swirling around the toilet bowl. Those are the people who pull like a gravitational force everybody else into decline with them. They are the people who are in despair while covering their lives in a veneer of smiles and pleasure and wanton living. Avoid people like that. For in verse 6, among them are those who enter into households and captivate weak women, weighed down with sins, led on by various impulses, always learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth, which is a very, very convicting passage. Now, you read a passage like this, and it's hard not to despair. If you're living for God and you're trying to be one of God's people in a dark and declining civilization, it can cause you to despair a great deal. And there are others as well in the Bible who know exactly what that feels like. Elijah, back in 1 Kings chapter 19, he felt so in despair that God had to practically kickstart him, well, literally had to kickstart him actually, multiple times to actually get moving again. He's under a tree and he just says, God, I'm done. They've killed all the other prophets. I quit. Just kill me now. And God has to shove him along. And so then he goes and hides in a cave and says, God, I'm done. I don't want to do this anymore. And God has to shove him along again. He's got to jumpstart him like a car with an old battery. You know why? Because Elijah is in despair in a declining civilization surrounded by people who hate him and hate God. Jeremiah was the same way, and multiple times Jeremiah talks about, wouldn't it have been better if I had just never been born? If I had never been alive, if my parents had never heard me cry for the first time, if I had not seen such dark days, I wish I had never been born. Solomon also despaired for a different reason. Solomon is interesting because Solomon was no persecuted prophet the way Elijah and Jeremiah were. Solomon lived in a palace and he had everything that he wanted. He had all the wealth of the world flowing into his kingdom. And yet he wrote a book called Ecclesiastes, whose theme is vanity of vanities. What a complete waste of time this has all been. Now, Solomon realized something in the book of Ecclesiastes, which of course we don't have time to sit here and study, but in chapter 2 and verse 20, he even makes the statement, therefore I despaired in all of my labors. I despaired because of everything that my hand had done. I despaired. Even in all this wealth and opulence, I was in despair. Because he realized that a life spent living by 2 Timothy 3 was a wasted life. I imagine that if Solomon could have read 2 Timothy 3, that passage that we just read a moment ago, if Solomon could have read this passage on, oh wow, lovers of self, lovers of money, disobedient to parents, because Solomon did not listen to the edict of his father David the way he had commanded it. Ooh, wow, I read a lot of myself in 2 Timothy 3. I imagine Solomon would have read a lot of himself in 2 Timothy 3. It is difficult when you're trying to be one of the faithful ones, to live through dark times. And Paul in 2 Timothy 3 certainly isn't mincing any words with his friend Timothy. But there is a reassurance that he offers in the second half of the passage that we'll read. Beginning in verse 8. And just as Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses, so these men also oppose the truth. Men of depraved mind, rejected as regards the faith, but they will not make further progress, for their folly will be obvious to all, as also that of those two came to be. Now, Jannes and Jambres are not mentioned by name anywhere else in Scripture, but there is Jewish tradition in the Talmud that says that Jannes and Jambres were two of the wizards in the court of Pharaoh who opposed Moses back in the book of Exodus. That when Moses and Aaron came to ask Pharaoh to let the Israelites go, and they performed some signs. Remember, there were some wizards in Pharaoh's court that were able to do some of those signs also. They could pull out from their shirt some parlor tricks as well. They could pull a few rabbits out of the hat. But there were some things that they couldn't do that only Moses and Aaron could do. And so supposedly, again, this is Jewish tradition that sort of fills this in, but supposedly their names were Jannes and Jambres. And they opposed Moses face to face. They denied the power of God being shown in Moses and Aaron in the miracles that they could do. And in the end, who's the one that looks stupid with egg on their face? Or probably frogs on their face? It was those wizards in Pharaoh's court. Because at some point they realized they were in way over their heads. And so Paul adds this bit of reassurance in verses 10 and 11. But you followed my teaching, my conduct, my purpose, my faith, my patience, my love, my perseverance, And you also followed in my persecutions and my sufferings, just as happened to me at Antioch, at Iconium, and at Lystra, what persecutions I endured. And out of all of them, the Lord delivered me. You can reverse the decline. Decline doesn't have to be so precipitous as to not come back from the edge, okay? And Paul's antidote to that decline is you have to be someone who opposes the current. You can't ever change the current unless you do something. Remember, even in the Jordan River, during the time of the great hero Joshua, God could reverse the current of the Jordan River. And if God can part the Red Sea and reverse the current of the Jordan River, and if God could do so many wonderful and amazing things through his prophets over the many, many years, God can empower us to stand against a declining civilization or a declining family or a declining church. He can empower us to stand by these things: the teaching of the apostles, the conduct of men like Paul who left us good examples, the purpose that we're to feel as God's people, the faith that is a faith once for all delivered, the patience that stands alongside love as the three greatest Christian virtues, love itself, perseverance, which leads, of course, to endurance. And as James chapter 1 says, when we learn to endure, we become perfect, as God intends for us to be perfect. But along with that, in verse 11, to be clear, there will be persecution and there will be suffering. If you're going to stand against decline, and if you're going to stand against difficult things in difficult days, you better be prepared for the persecution and suffering that comes along with that. In difficult times, it is the duty of God's people to let their faith stand out as obviously as the folly stands out in other people's lives. To stand out and to stand apart. Like Jesus said in Matthew 5, to be a city set on a hill, a light that shone, salt of the earth that makes everything around it taste that much better. Don't be surprised in 1 Peter chapter 4. Don't be surprised at the fiery ordeal that comes upon you, for your testing as though some strange thing were happening to you. But you stand up against that persecution. You endure it as Paul did, and as Paul encourages Timothy to do as well in this letter. And though kingdoms may rise and fall, and families may rise and fall, and even as churches go through their natural life cycles, as history shows time and time again, through all of it, the faith of God's people is like a string woven that does not fall, but continues to rise and rise and rise up again every time it gets knocked down by the forces of evil and Satan. So at this time, I'm going to bring my lesson to a close and offer a simple invitation to you. Seems like 2 Timothy 3 is saying there's only two options. You're part of this crowd or you're part of the other crowd. You're going in one direction or you're going in the opposite direction. You're declining along with a world that is lost and corrupted by sin that 1 John 5 says lies in the power of the evil one, or you become a citizen of heaven. And Colossians 3 says you keep seeking those things above where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Two options, two different paths, a choice that you have to make. Be one of God's people or be one of Satan's people. The decision could not be any simpler than that. So listen to the gospel message put very simply in Mark 16:16. He who believes and is baptized shall be saved. Whatever spiritual need you might have, please let that need be known by coming forward as we stand and sing.